Good morning. I'm James Bennett, and as promised, I'm going to give a reading, just a short reading, about 10 minutes or so, from my work in progress, which is fair to say it's an epic fantasy novel. Um, I would, I'm giving it a provisional working title of A Song of Shades. Well, it's not really a working title because it has a title, but I don't want to tell you yet. It's a secret. So this is, it's a relative. And just to give you a little bit of background, I wanted to kind of go back to the source of what I love about fantasy, the real source. So I was drawing on Tolkien, Ursula Le Guin, Jack Vance, Michael Moorcock, all the old greats basically that really got me started on the road of fantasy. And I wanted to take these elements, kind of mix them up with my experience and my my journey as a writer, and see what I could come up with to write something big and epic and in a secondary world. And I've tried this before several times, from when I was very young to now, and I've never really been able to do it. And this one it's always defeated me, and this one seems to be working. So to give you a little bit of background, surfacely, as you might imagine, it's just a big old quest to save the world. That's the premise, but it has obviously slight twists within there. There's been a great war, and it's the aftermath of the Great War, so all the big epic action has kind of already happened in the story, and this is in the world that's kind of left, so it's calling into play a lot of like what we do with power, and how we're ultimately our own worst enemy. And really, does the world even deserve saving? Some of the characters would doubt that anyway. Okay, so it's a little bit on the dark side. Obviously it's dealing with quite adult themes. And what you have is our main character is a thief called Ruse Canto and a priest called Ida, and they are on this quest looking for a thingamajig. I don't want to give too much away. And they find themselves stranded in the middle of a desert, the two of them and this magician called Toll, who's not really in this bit, but she's present. So yeah, and when we come in, they're stranded in the desert, and they come across this old abandoned keep, an old fortress from the war that was, and they can see all the bones of the dead and all the armour and some of the old machines that they don't know how they work anymore, but they can just see that they're ruined, half covered in sand. So they come to the aftermath of this great battle and the fall of the keep. And they have this big argument. They don't particularly like each other, obviously a thief and a priest. Among other things, they have a lot of conflict, but they have to rely on each other to survive. So at the time I'm reading this, Ruse, our hero of sorts, has walked off in the keep. They've had this argument, and he's just stormed off and walked off down this corridor. So he's gone down this corridor, and that's where I'm going to begin. When Ruse raised his torch, the wall before him glittered like a curtain of gems, the sheer black stone of the keep reaching up to the sky, though no stars winked to distinguish it. Only his torch fluttered in the darkness, reflecting off the surface before him. A gasp plumed from him at the sight, unbidden through his despair. Thin sheets of water were pouring from somewhere in the heights, slicking the wall before him, the granite worn smooth, as polished as a mirror. Fungi and moss framed the happenstance mirror, glowing a soft and venomous green. His torch drew shadows across the surrounding dripstone, which hung down like the fangs of some skeletal guardian. His joy at the presence of water, perhaps even clean and drinkable water, wavered as he stepped towards the pool. The flames of his torch leapt up the wall and caught his reflection in its surface, an image of himself in black glass. Ash covered him from head to foot, making it difficult to see which part of him was formed of rags and which part flesh. Only the white of his eyes shone, and the streak in his hair, a pearl and a dash of grey. Standing there before the mirror, it was as though the darkness had devoured most of him, leaving only scraps. You were nothing. At that moment, it was easy to believe the aspirant. He could see it for himself. What had become of him since God's day, since plucking the pouch from the priest in the bazaar? The hem was a home for cutthroats, where one turned a blind eye to the dead, bartering with anything to hand from rations to offers of murder, but he'd still have given all he had to walk there once again. Not that he had anything to give. The likelihood of return was slight, he knew, the promise of freedom an empty one, but it was all he had to cling to, his only reason to go on. Survival had become a habit. He knew no other way to be. Even though the waste stretched for leagues around him under a coal-smoked sky, he sensed then that it was also a cage, a prison with no way out. It surprised him to realise that this wasn't the nub of his fear. Death, as he'd always known, was inevitable. Around the next corner on a black cloak's blade, a misstep on a high ledge, gasping for water in the dust. Or, if these ends happened to spare him, breaking apart into splinters of rock as the stainless finally failed and the minim shook itself apart. Up until now, Ruse had kept ahead of despair by living day to day, fixing only on food and shelter, sending Glint home to the threshold, a tithe on his guilt. Like a shadow he'd slipped through the ash, so cunning, so quick, a ghost, a stranger, there 1 minute and gone the next, a silver-tongued fox, luring men and women into his bed so that he could pay his rent. He was sharp-eyed, sharp-eared, sharp-witted. Why, it was fair to say he'd turned survival into an art. But survival was a lonely business, and for all his cleverness and cutting remarks, the priest had seen right through him. Oh, he could face dying all right, or so he told himself, an end to all his trials. To know that no one would miss him when he did, that no one would even know of his passing or remember he'd been there, was a horror so cold, so deep within him, that he'd refused to acknowledge it himself. Ida had spoken the truth. He was nothing, no one. The wind would blow ash over his footprints, the clouds would sweep by unmoved. Would Vral give a lonely cry, he wondered, perched upon his bones? Even so, the echoes would fade as if they'd never been. I'm lost, truly. He was puzzling over the revelation, wondering what to do with his pain, when a glint in the mirror caught his attention. He'd been staring so hard into its depths that he hadn't noticed the shift in the light, the aura of the fungi growing brighter, his torch burning low. The mirror flashed, an emerald star, and all his introspection scattered, his fear eclipsed by one more immediate, his heart climbing into his throat. The light wasn't from the fungi at all. It was coming from the mirror. The eye! As in the pool at Disara, his left eyelid peeled back of its own volition, evidently roused by his reflection. Through a shocked plume of breath, he found himself gazing into a broad and depthless space, no longer a mirror at all, a vision. A great cavern spread out before him, the corroded edges of the glass rendered a sudden door. Stalactites, bridges and spars went marching off into the gloom, and between one moment and the next he was staring down the length of a monster's throat. It was though he stood on the edge of a precipice, his head spinning with the expanse of the grotto, an impossible perspective. The cold came up to greet him, another wonder, dusting ash from his clothes. His torch snuffed out, a curl of smoke in the murk. There was nothing soft or soothing in the wind, which carried a heavy pall of sulphur and a ripeness that was all too familiar. Frost bit at his nipples, wormed its way into his groin, seeking the softer parts of him. Gagging, swaying on the brink, Ruse found that he couldn't move, the darkness billowing, unfolding like wings. And through it all, that pinpoint of green, drawing him back to his reflection. He could see himself clearly enough, the occult twinkling in his skull, but now he gauged that he stood in a high place, a plateau of rock thrusting from the cavern floor. Atop it, a building loomed, broad steps leading up to a long colonnade, which in turn supported an architrave. The building, which resembled some kind of palace or temple, looked as if it had fallen from a great height, shattering like an egg on the plateau. Every column stood cracked and crooked, teeth in a broken skull. The architrave had snapped, he saw, the frieze it bore split in two. Roofs made out symbols, carved by some ancient hand, God's runes perhaps, a crescent moon, the bulbs of an hourglass. It was then he realised he wasn't alone. A figure stood atop the steps, watching him from between the pillars. Despite the distance, he could see the sweep of a gown fluttering on the strange wind, a pennon of hair seething with it. The pale stone served to highlight the figure, rendering it a silhouette, the curve of its bosom and hips unmistakable. He knew he was looking at a woman, impossibly a woman in the mirror. But she was dark, so dark, the whole of her comprised of shadow, as though she'd been cut from the night. Only a light glimmered in her head, the single sparkling of a star, as bright as a polished emerald. "Vessel, I see you." As though propelled by his gasp, Rue stumbled backwards, a hand flung out to deny her. To his alarm, he watched the woman echo the gesture, a half-second behind his own. But it was only as she slipped forward, descending the temple steps, that he experienced true horror, the cold piercing the core of him. With regal grace, the woman moved as if underwater, her gown, her hair wreathing in the air, or whatever passed for air in those subterranean bounds. She was no more than smoke, and as fragile, yet the source of her light looked solid enough, a blazing orb embedded in her skull. It was an eye, he realised, as jewelled as his own, sharing its reflection. But something was amiss in his appraisal. The jewel in question was on the right side of her face, he saw, whereas his was on the left. As far as he knew, a mirror didn't reverse an image, only flip it perpendicular to its surface. Yet it was the eye that joined them, of that he was certain, a brilliant spot on the wall before him, pinning him with her scrutiny. As the woman approached, he too was drawing close to meet her, bound to the law of mirrors even as his visitant broke them. She had usurped his reflection, taking its place. But he didn't share her grace, jerking towards the wall in stiff, awkward movements. Swallowing a scream, it was clear which of them was the master of the mirror and which the slave. He forced out a groan, his fingernails biting into his palms, but his legs refused to obey him, pulling him towards the slick black stone. The light was filling his vision, beaming beyond the boundaries of the glass, beyond the bounds of the real. Its glow did nothing to penetrate the gloom, and certainly not the darkness of her, who drew nearer like an approaching death, a doorway into nothingness, her hand reaching out. "Do you know me, Duskborn? Do you know my name?" Ruse did not, and wasn't willing to guess, repelled by the echoes in his head, the whisper of silk over bones. Helpless, a puppet on a string, he watched his arms slowly rise. He was at the glass now, the water inches from the tip of his nose, its coolness speckling his cheeks, his lips. Even up close he couldn't read her expression, her face an impenetrable mask. In the waxing light the cavern was growing indistinct, a refulgence that seemed to poison the air, boring into his skull with her proximity. Sweat prickled on his brow. His palms stretched towards the glass, fingers splayed to meet his reflection, join with her in shadow. "Begone!" With an effort of will, Ruse focused on the space around him, desperately clinging to the solid and the known. His ward against the dark resounded in his skull, summoned as it was from 100 bedside tales, the ghosts that had spilled from his mother's lips come nethertide on the farm. At once, the sound of the cascade filled his ears, a soft, ceaseless rushing. Roaring, he tore his gaze away from the mirror, pouring all of his strength into his limbs. There came a flash, green and blindingly bright, and a peculiar sucking sound. Then the pull of the glass released him. Arms wheeling, he went stumbling backwards, landing on his rump. Dazed, he sat there, gawping up at the wall. The woman in the glass hissed, vexed by his defiance. Released from him, she raised a fist, her arm a wisp of shadow. With a force belied by her slender figure, she struck her side of the mirror, the broom around her swirling, describing the unseen barrier. Black stone drank in her fury, the wall shuddering up to the heights. Rubble skittered down, chunks of granite shattering on the flagstones, urging Roos to his feet. In his skull, a familiar burning, pregnant with fire. A great wind buffeted around him, blasting out of nowhere, cold as the grave. Cursing, he brought a hand to the left side of his face, covering his wound. He wasn't about to let the woman beguile him again. Thanking his reclaimed limbs, he leapt to his feet, sucking air into his lungs. Without daring a glance over his shoulder, chased by booming stone, Roos fled back the way he had come. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.